Hi, it's Rob from the Bush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to paint the Witch-king of Angmar. Now it's going to be in almost two parts. It's going to be painting up the Witch-king himself first, so you can use the same techniques on the standing miniature and then on the mounted miniature at the same time. And then we're going to be doing the horse after that, so that you can get both miniatures finished off. If you'd like to support the channel, our Ko-fi and Patreon pages are linked below. Now on to the video.
The first colour we're going to use is Citadel Iron Hand Steel. I'm going to use this to paint up all of his weapons and his armour as well. Two little ends to like the straps that he has going across his torso as well. You can paint them with a little bit of silver. Also you've got his feet at the bottom too. Wanted to paint up the horse for this miniature as well because it obviously comes with the horse, but it's really cool. I painted up this part at the same time as painting up the Witch-king on horseback, so you can follow this tutorial part for the standing Witch-king and paint up the guy on horseback too. So now using Citadel Nuln Oil just to shade all of the armour plates and his weaponry. Got a really wicked looking sword, and that flail is just immense. Next up we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Agrax Earthshade. This is going to be just to add a little bit of kind of grime and aging to the weapons and some of his armour. Just get a little bit of this on your brush and kind of spread it around a bit. You don't want too much because you don't want his armour to be metallic brown. You just want enough to make it look a little bit grimy, so that when you're adding the colours back on in a moment, you will have that grime effect there, and you'll be adding the silver back on. So it'll just be mainly in the recesses. So we're going to return to Citadel Iron Hand Steel now and start putting some of the colour back onto his armour and weaponry. So the larger flatter areas I'm using a bit more than I am on the areas that are a bit mottled, or the areas with the detail. You want to pick out those details so that you can see all of them on a miniature, like between the ridges on his armour plates, and like each of the separate sections on his hands, on his helm, that kind of thing. And I just gave it kind of a rough dry brush of Iron Hand's steel on his sword, because the sword has all those sort of mottled, rusty kind of dimples in the blade. So just kind of lightly dry brush the top sides of that. Now using a little bit of Citadel Necron Compound and just lightly dragging this over the surfaces, and that'll give you that nice shine that his old beaten up armour seems to have. Really do like this miniature though. It's a really good miniature. Not even sure I've got an army that can field him, but I thought it's a cracking pose, and it's a cracking miniature itself, especially the horse. The horse is really good. Now I'm going to use a little bit of black just to go over any areas where we might have gone onto them with the metallics. As I say, if you're painting this one, paint up the one on horseback alongside it. And then once we've finished painting up this guy, we'll be moving on to just painting the horse, because the one on horseback, it doesn't have any additional details, it just has no flail in one hand. So it is very easy to follow the same guide using the same principles on highlighting and shading and stuff like that on the one on horseback, which does look incredibly dynamic once you start highlighting that cloak that's swirling round off his back. Now I'm going to highlight the robes with Vallejo German Grey. Here we're adding this to the surfaces that will be catching the light. So you want to do this, there's the sort of like top half of him with the kind of cloak and robe, and then you've got the lower part which is underneath. So as I'm painting this, I'm going to do one extra highlight on the top half. Just change one of the greys on the bottom half, just so that you have that slight difference in colour. Now I'm going to use Citadel Eshin Grey. I'm going to use this to highlight the robes on the bottom. It's ever so slightly different from the German Grey. It's slightly lighter colour. So I figured if we do the bottom part in this and then give an extra highlight to the top, it'll just make those look ever so slightly different, so that they stand up, or stand out rather, as two separate items of clothing. Now I'm going to use Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey. This is going to be to do edge highlights on all of the edges that will be catching the light. This is where all the details start to really stand out on those robes. So you want to go down all those edges with the Mechanicus Standard Grey. Think about which edges will be catching the light and where the light will be catching them. So if you've got those kind of sunken sections of robe where it curls around like under his arm there, you would be highlighting the bottom edge. So this is with the Mechanicus Standard Grey on it. We are now going to use a little bit of Citadel Dawnstone just to add some tinier highlights to those Mechanicus Standard Grey sections. So certain parts will have this little lighter highlight just to make those stand out. But we're only using this highlight on the top half of the miniature, or on his top robes, I should say. You've got that sleeves, the little bit draped across his front and across his back. Then you've got the robes underneath where you're going to leave it as Mechanicus Standard Grey. So that's the finished Witch King so far. We haven't sprayed it with the varnish yet, so it's not quite crisped up. And this is the Witch King on horseback, painted up in exactly the same style. No changes whatsoever to the colours used or anything like that. And the only thing I have done is I've added some of the metallics to the horse already, but we'll be touching them up a little bit later. So for the horse, we're going to use Citadel Mournfang Brown. It's a very, very light colour for the horse, but don't worry, it works. Got plenty of straps and details on this. Next we're going to use Citadel Contrast Wyldwood and just give it a good layer of Wyldwood on the skin. Slightly off camera there, unfortunately. What this does, this darkens down the Mournfang Brown. Bit of rhyming there by accident. And also goes into the recesses more, so you get that nice shade in all those little bits of the horse's skin. If you get to any part and it looks slightly thin, you can give it another layer if you want to. I'm going to use a little bit of Black Templar Contrast from Citadel just to paint the tail. That gives the tail a slightly different colour from the rest of the horse. I'm going to use a little bit of Pink Horror. This is going to be to do the inside of the mouth. So you've got around the edges of all the teeth, you have the tongue and the back of the mouth too. So you can just give that a full going over. Like so. Next we're going to use a tiny little bit of Citadel Mephiston Red, and this is just to do the horse's eyes. So we're giving them that creepy red glow that they have in the Lord of the Rings. Like so. Now I'm going to use Citadel Carroburg Crimson. I'm going to shade the eyes and also the entire mouth, including the teeth and the tongue. You want to get that Carroburg Crimson all over that area. Not too much, you don't want to have tons and tons of it in there, but you want enough that it goes into all the recesses on the mouth and that kind of thing. Now I'm going to use Citadel Pink Horror again, and we're just going to add some colour back to the tongue. Also, if you can add a little tiny bit to the gums above and below the teeth, There's not really too much there, so you don't really have to. You can add it to the tongue and then maybe a line down each side at the back of the mouth too. Now we're going to add a little bit of Vallejo White to the pink horror, just to give that tongue a little bit of a highlight. If you can hear any noise in the background, once again, there is a small kitten scampering about. Now we're going to be using a little bit of Citadel Rakarth flesh, and we're just going to paint the teeth on the horse. If you approach these by getting a tiny little bit of paint on your brush and using downward strokes to go from the sort of gum line to the end of the tooth, you'll be able to get a nice sharp tooth colour on there. So for the eyes, we're now going to use some Citadel Mephiston Red. We're going to put a large spot of this on each eye so that you've still got some of that Carroburg crimson around the edges. Next we're going to be using a little bit of Citadel Evil Sunz Scarlet. We're going to put a slightly smaller spot of this onto the eyes, like so. Just touching that up there. I'm going to finish by adding a tiny spot of Citadel Wyldwood Red in the centre of the eye, so that you get that red glow from each eye. Now I'm going to use a tiny little bit of Rhinox hide just to make the area around the mouth slightly darker than the rest of the miniature. You tend to find that horses will have, or darker horses will have darker areas around the mouths. Now I'm going to use Citadel Thondia Brown. I'm going to start highlighting the rest of the horse's body. Now you're going to be putting highlights on the top where the light's catching it, as there is plenty of shade and almost highlight from the contrast over the Mournfang brown. And this is just to add that final level of highlights to the skin, because you don't want it to go too light, because it is a very, very dark horse. So just using the Thondia Brown as the final highlight on top of that will pick out the details and make them stand out without it being too bright or too light. I'm going to use a little bit of Vallejo German Grey and start highlighting the hooves. I've been looking at horses' hooves to paint these up, and on the darker horses they tend to be fairly dark, and then you can get some that have almost like light coloured striations, or kind of like maybe Rakarth flesh or almost bone kind of striations on them if they're slightly lighter by the feet. So I'm doing these with German Grey, and then I'm going to use a tiny little bit of Baneblade Brown and just put some very, very fine kind of horizontal striations in them. Next up, we're going to use a little bit more Iron Hand Steel, and this to pick out the horseshoes on the underside of the feet, which I was very impressed that they've actually put on a model. You can shade these with Null Oil if you want to. I didn't really bother because you can't see them all that well when the miniature is stood upright. They do get their own shade, so it's no worries if you don't want to shade those, but if you do, that's not a problem. I'm going to use some Vallejo Black just to go over all the straps and the armour and cloth around the horse's head, just to make sure that you haven't got any of the other colours on those areas. We are just going to give them a little highlight with German grey, because we want them to be nice and dark. Don't want them standing out too much as the cloak. So we're just going to highlight them with a little bit of German grey, mainly along the edges of those straps and the armour. If you want to do a highlight with Mechanicus standard grey at the end, you can do, that's not a problem. That will help them stand out a little bit more, so depending on how you want it to look, that's fine to do that too. So this is the finished Witch-king of Angmar on foot. Really happy with how it turned out. Doesn't actually use too many colours, but the overall effect you can get from just those few colours is really, really cool, and they look great on the tabletop. So the mounted Witch-king, really pleased with how that turned out as well. It's actually the first horse I've painted on the channel, and I'm really, really happy with how it turned out. Cracking model, looks really cool, will look great slaying the forces of good.
Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media linked below. Thanks very much.
If you like the channel and enjoy the content, please consider supporting us on our Ko-fi and Patreon page linked below. Thanks very much.